I'm just gonna spend a little bit of time here introducing our speaker, which I can see Alan is on right now. Welcome, Alan. So first, I actually want to extend some thank yous and some gratitude. One, to all of the members of our DOI group who have put a lot of effort into making this happen, and all of the projects that we've been involved with. It's really been fascinating and really inspiring for me to be involved with this group of people who care so passionately about this topic like I do. So thank you all. Also, thank you to the BPRG leadership, to Anne and Ron and Dick for convening this organization, which we've all met through and are happy to work with. Thank you especially to Sherry, who is our technical guru and really the glue that is all holding us together right now. So thank you, Sherry. And thank you, of course, to everyone who is here and participating in this. I think it's really wonderful to see so many people here that care about this conversation. So thank you all. Most importantly, thank you to Alan Davis, Dr. Alan Davis, who is joining us here today. I have the pleasure and honor of introducing Dr. Davis. So Dr. Davis is an assistant professor at Ohio State University, as well as an adjunct assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University in the Center for Psychedelics and Consciousness Research. His research focuses on understanding, enhancing, and innovating evidence-based treatments for substance use and other trauma-related disorders. If you look into Dr. Davis's work, I really don't think it's premature to say that his spread is prolific or verging on prolific. He was a member of the Johns Hopkins psilocybin project team with Dr. Roland Griffiths and other folks. But his work has also touched upon ibogaine treatments for opioid and other trauma-related disorders, as well as very recently some intriguing work with quote-unquote fast-acting tryptamines, including 5-MeO, DMT, which he gave a wonderful presentation on last year at Horizons. So we are very excited and very thankful to have Dr. Davis with us here, presenting on the topic of psychedelics, observing the effects of psychedelics on symptoms of trauma in people of color who have a history of racial trauma. So without further ado, I would like to turn the microphone over to Dr. Davis and listen to him speak.
Thank you so much, Benoit, for that lovely introduction. I'm going to attempt to share my screen so I can share slides with folks for this talk. Please let me know if anybody's having any trouble seeing those. They should be up on the screen now. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, wonderful. Well, I feel honored to have been invited to come and meet with everyone today and share a little bit about some of the research that I'm working on, and hopefully, answer any questions that I can about this new study that we've been connecting with. As Benoit mentioned, this is a study about people of color who experience racial trauma and reporting decreases in mental health symptoms after naturalistic psychedelic use. So I'm going to go through really what led up to this study, some of our other work that set the foundation for this, and talk a little bit about the findings from this project as well, and as well as future work that we're hoping to do. However, as every study that I've ever worked on, it certainly does not happen in isolation, and well, I guess pandemic times excluded, maybe some work happens in isolation. But this study happened with a wonderful team, including my co-principal investigator, Monica Williams, who is up at the University of Ottawa. We also have a great team of collaborators from Yale, including Angela Haney, Yitong Zhen, who is my grad student here at Ohio State, Pamela Grigas, and Nate Cepeda, and others on the list who are not pictured there. But we all came together to work on this project in part because of some of the foundational work that Monica has been doing, documenting the lack of diverse perspectives in psychedelic science. And so she and I decided to kind of bring together our passions, not only related to this topic, but also bringing in some of the history of survey-based research that I have done to really see if we could focus an entire study specifically on the topic of people of color. And we're really excited about having completed the project, and we're hoping that the first paper will be published sometime in the next month or two, which is very exciting. So I also should acknowledge that there was some funding for this work specific to the study of people of color. The University of Ottawa provided funding for us to conduct this study. And then in general, the work that I'm engaged in with this, as well as other projects, has been provided by the Stephen and Alexandra Cohen Foundation, as well as a bunch of individual donors to the Center for Psychedelics and Consciousness Research. All right, so before I tell you about the outline and go into some of these findings, I just want to acknowledge kind of who I am in this work, because I think that something that has become apparent to me in my work in a variety of different spaces, including psychedelic research, is identity, and how different identities kind of shape the work that's being done in lots of different places in research. So I am a middle-aged, just turned 40 this year. I am a white, cisgendered, queer male. My trajectory into this work has certainly benefited from being a white man. And I mention this because part of what set the foundation for me to want to focus my time and energy in this space and to connect with Monica on this topic was because of really seeing two sides of a coin for myself, of having a certain amount of power and privilege in research spaces and in society as a whole, and also having part of my identity that was had experienced challenging things in the past because of my queer identity, and run into certain issues both in community and society, as well as in academic spaces. And so I felt a personal connection to some of this work, and I'm hoping to expand some of this into LGBT populations as well. So this was really a first step to see if we could kind of bring the resources and the focus together in underrepresented populations as a bigger picture. And we decided to start off with people of color, recognizing that there was a great need in these communities. So that is what brought us to this project. So first, I'm going to just, and I know this is probably very common information, but it will help, I think, set the foundation for explaining the model of results that we're finding across a lot of different projects, and specifically what we found with our People of Color project. So as most everyone in this Zoom room probably knows, there are a variety of acute psychedelic effects that people might have. And one of the most commonly reported psychedelic effects is the mystical experience. And certainly that has been reported as one of the things that contributes to beneficial outcomes when people have a psychedelic experience, whether that's in a laboratory setting or in their natural environment or in a party environment. These experiences happen kind of across different contexts. And in addition to the mystical experience, we've been very interested recently in exploring insight experiences and the types of new realizations and understandings and awarenesses that people might have during the acute effects of a psychedelic. And the reason that I start off with these two is because they come together in a model called quantum change. And that's essentially what happens when insight and mystical experiences happen at the same time, in the same experience. And this is not something new. This was actually a model that was coined outside of psychedelic research by a person named Bill Miller, who has worked a lot on developing treatments for people with substance use disorders. And he defined it as a rapid and enduring transformation that might occur when these experiences happen at the same time. And I became very interested in insight because it was one of the things that was more frequently reported in anecdotal reports of psychedelic experiences, often referred to as a download or some type of new information that they had gotten during the experience, and how important these experiences were for folks. So we started looking at this in a variety of different studies prior to the project with people of color. In the first study that we published looking at this model of quantum change, we were interested in looking at people who had experienced changes in their alcohol use after a psychedelic experience. And we first started with a sample of 343 people who all reported problems with alcohol use prior to having a psychedelic experience. And for these folks, most of whom were white, most of them who were male, had pretty moderate or severe levels of alcohol use and problems related to their alcohol use. When we looked at modeling this in a statistical model, what you see in red is that quantum changes in relationship to several other features here, including the dose of the psychedelic, how much they were drinking prior to the experience, and the degree to which it was personally meaningful. But the strong relations here came out showing that insight and mystical experiences are interrelated. They seem to be, in this example, moderately correlated, and they were both contributed to this overall reduction in alcohol use after a psychedelic experience. So we followed that up with a sample of people who experienced drug problems, kind of curious if this model would hold in a new group of individuals. And what we found here was, perhaps not surprisingly, the sample was comprised very similar to a lot of the studies up to that time on the topic of psychedelics, largely a white male sample. Most of them had moderate or severe substance use disorder. And this could have been really anything except for alcohol. So this was kind of looking in drugs more specifically. And what we found here was very similar. So we see this pop up again, that insight experiences and mystical experiences seem to be related, and that they are related to a decrease in drug use after having a psychedelic experience. And so both of these studies, I think, really started to shine a light on the importance of this. However, up until that point, there was really no comprehensive measure of insight. We were measuring insight with one item, which basically just asked people, how psychologically insightful was your experience? And yet we have full measures measuring different components of mystical experiences and other types of acute effects. So this led us to create an entire questionnaire on the topic of insight and to try to develop a psychometrically standardized measure that could measure this type of effect. And so that led us to a study of people with depression and anxiety. So we created that insight measure really with the intention of further kind of elaborating that and hopefully producing a measure for other researchers and maybe even to be used in clinical practice someday. So this study, not surprisingly, again, similarly comprised of mostly white male, but a large sample, almost 1,000 people with depression and anxiety. And what you see here is the same model came out. When we use this more comprehensive measure of insight, we see that, again, mystical and insight experiences are co-occurring in psychedelic experiences, and that both are significantly related to, in this case, an improvement in depression and anxiety. So it certainly seemed to be the writing on the wall, at least in terms of survey work. The writing was on the wall that insight was certainly a meaningful factor that should be measured, and that it might be the combination of these experiences that are contributing to the most benefit. So that brought us to about the time that I met Monica, and we started talking about how all of this might relate to racial trauma, and specifically thinking about people of color who've had a traumatic event related to their ethnicity, and because of that event developed traumatic kind of more PTSD-like symptoms because of perhaps one or perhaps repeated trauma. And so we started thinking about how could we best assess this, and we put together a survey that included the insight questionnaire, included the mystical experiences questionnaire, and a bunch of questions asking about the types of traumas they'd they'd experienced, and I guess most importantly, to test this model, whether or not psychedelic experiences in general were helpful. And if they were, then what features of those psychedelic experiences might have been helpful to people of color. So I'm sure that some of this information is probably well known to people, but obviously ethnic discrimination and race-based trauma is extremely prevalent among people of color, and it confers an enormous amount of personal health burden on an individual. Current approved treatments for PTSD specifically, or for trauma-based problems specifically, are already limited in effectiveness and adherence. So even if you take out the fact that they're not tailored for people of color, which is a big issue, even if under the best of circumstances, when you apply them to people who they were developed with, they're already limited. But they have not been tailored for people of color, which means that they're extremely lacking in this population, or in these populations. And so it's possible that psychedelic assisted therapy certainly could be a new avenue that is important to explore. And that's one of the things that I know Monica is certainly very interested in kind of developing in her work as well. So we examined how the use of psychedelics, and again, this was in the naturalistic environment, so people could have used these psychedelics really in any type of setting, at home, or they could have been in some type of group psychedelic experience, but really in any place that they chose. And then we followed up them at a later time point, asking about their prior experiences. All right, so this sample, as you probably can already imagine, was very different from the other surveys that we had done. So this, in order to get into this study, someone had to identify as a person of color. They also had to be a resident of the US or Canada. And that was in part because we wanted to have enough people in the study from one, or kind of a general geographic area, that we could do some advanced statistical modeling with that group. And so we restricted it to US and Canada for that reason. But also there is a long history in both countries of not only racial trauma in its current form, but also a long history of colonization and issues with subjecting indigenous cultures to a variety of different traumas. And so we felt it was important that if we were going to focus this study, that we kind of restricted to these two countries as a start, although clearly racial trauma happens across the world, and more work could be done to explore this topic outside of these two countries. All right, so this sample was very different, obviously. We had about a third of our sample identified as Black or of African heritage, about a third identified as Asian heritage, about 15% were either reported being Native American or Indigenous Canadian, and about 20% reported being either Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, or a variety of other I didn't have enough space to list them all, but we allowed people to write in their own identities as well. And that was about the remaining 20% of folks. That should be a percent and not a 5, but about 20% of the sample were Hispanic, and about 56% identify as female. So just from the start, we were really happy that not only were we able to focus on people of color, but we were able to have more of a balance in the sex of our sample, as indicated there by how many female participants we had. And when you look at the specific psychedelic drugs that people had used in their experience, most of them had used LSD and psilocybin, which is quite common in our survey studies. Those are just two of the more frequently reported substances. Although a pretty large proportion, almost a quarter of them, reported MDMA. And then we had about 18% who reported a variety of other things, and that could have included 5-MeO-DMT, mescaline, synthetic mescaline, peyote, etc. All right, so what were our findings? Well, what you see here is across 4 different mental health areas, including depression, anxiety, general stress, and trauma. What we see in this sample is a significant and large decrease in depression symptoms, anxiety, stress, and trauma symptoms from before to after their psychedelic experience. And this accounts for the different psychedelics that were reported in the study. So even after controlling for which type of psychedelic they had experienced, and also it controls for geography, we see that there were still these decreases in a variety of mental health problems. So we took those data and created a model similar to the models I showed previously. And what you see here on the left is mystical experience, insight experience. And we also decided to control for the challenging experiences that one might have had during the psychedelic experience. And in this study on the right, what you see is all of the different clusters of mental health problems that they might have experienced, including racial trauma symptoms, stress, depression, anxiety. And overall, what we find is these variables produce a significant model helping us understand that the acute intensity of psychedelic effects is strongly and significantly related to a decrease in mental health symptoms across all of these domains. And that includes accounting for any challenges that might have come up during the psychedelic experience. So again, mystical and insight experiences seem to co-occur for some people, and the strength of those experiences seems to be related to an improvement in mental health, and here specifically for people of color. What we find also quite important to report is that it wasn't just mental health that people seem to be reporting benefit from. In fact, this sample of people of color reported positive and desirable changes across almost every domain that we measured. Some of the highest reported domains, almost 80% of the sample reported positive and desirable changes in their attitude about themselves, in their general well-being and life satisfaction, and around 3/4 of the sample reported improvements in their attitudes about life, their mood, their relationships, and of course, a variety of other features. So this seemed to be not just a improvement in mental health functioning, but also in general, just helping improve people's lives. Now, whether one causes the other or whether improvement in life kind of helps improve their symptoms, with this type of study, we can't say the directionality of what caused those things, but at least these people, their own perspective in the data is telling us that they are related, and that there seems to be an association of the psychedelic experience with helping them overall in their life, including helping them with alleviating some of the challenging mental health problems that came from racial trauma. I wanted to provide a case report of one of our volunteers who was in our psilocybin for depression trial. And I thought this might be a nice way to illustrate some of the more nuanced features of the psychedelic experience that might be helpful and kind of make it a little bit more, bring it close to home. So this trial, like I mentioned, was for major depressive disorder. We provided 2 psilocybin sessions in this study with about 13 hours of psychotherapy. And before I tell you more about this person, I just wanted to show here that across a variety of different mental health measures, including depression, anxiety, and suicidality, for this person, we found a very large and rapid decrease in mental health problems right after the treatment at 1 week, and that up to 12 months later, this person was still experiencing benefit. It just occurred to me that my slides might be out of order because I didn't present any of the information about this person. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, now that you've seen the results of this person's treatment, I'll give you the background of who this person is. I apologize for my slides being out of order. So this was a person that I worked with. I was their guide in the psilocybin trial. It was me and Mary Casamano worked together with this person. This person is a young African-American female who comes from an immigrant family and immigrated to the US when they were a child. They had a very long history with not only challenging issues related to race and ethnicity and kind of coming into the US as as an immigrant, but also a lot of challenging features of their home environment, lots of emotional trauma, and really challenging family relationships. So they came to the study with a challenging traumatic history, but also with substantial depression and anxiety and social anxiety. And so when they came in, it became very clear that part of the therapeutic work that we would be doing with them is helping to work through potentially some of this trauma as it relates to their depression. And one of the, I think, really heart-wrenching facets of this person's, I think, history was the fact that they had been chronically suicidal for about 10 years at the point at which they came into the study. And as a clinician, that's something that is what amazed me, the fact that they had so much perseverance to deal with that for so long prior to reaching out for help in this way. But it also brought about a lot of hope and optimism that maybe this process, maybe this intervention might be helpful for them. Obviously, you see that it on the screen that it was helpful for them, which was a wonderful experience, I think, for everyone involved. But yes, as you see there, across all these domains, including suicidality, everything dropped after the treatment had occurred. But what was interesting is that this person reported some of the experience of their psilocybin sessions that seemed to be helpful to them in this process. So yes, no suicidal ideation since the second psilocybin session, large reduction in symptoms. At 6 months, they had been offered full-time employment at their job, which was very exciting. They had moved out of their father's house around 4 to 5 months after treatment, and that was in part of their kind of continuing traumatic experience was this family trauma, and they had, as a result of from what they said, as a result of their treatment, they were able to make more empowered decisions about things, including moving out of that environment. And they were planning to go back to school in the near future. So what were some of the self-reported mechanisms? Well, for this person, they reported in their first session being repeatedly buried alive for hours during their experience. And they said that we didn't, of course, on the outside, we didn't witness this because they were very still during the experience. Excuse me. They were very still during the experience. But after, they said that it was really quite torturous, that they had been, they would find themselves in this dark coffin, and they would be kind of internally trying to break through and trying to fight against this process. And there were all of these hands that they felt on their body in the experience, kind of pushing them down, and they would get to the point where they felt like they were just about to break through, and then they would be buried again. And they said that it went on for what seemed like hours and hours and hours in the experience, until at one point they said that they just gave up. They said, you know what, I've wanted to die for a better part of my entire life. And so what would that be like? What would it be like if I just died? And they let themselves go into that process. And they said that in the moment that they had that experience of just letting go into being buried, immediately they recognized that all of the hands that were holding them down were their own. And that led to immediate kind of coming out of this being buried process into the light and into a different sense of feeling empowered and feeling in control of themselves, of their path, of their process, in a way that they said was transformational for them. This thought that not only could they have been in part of the process of what was holding them back, but that they had the agency and the power to experience the relief of that and to be able to move forward and step into that empowerment. Later on in that session, as I mentioned, they had reported pretty substantial social anxiety. And one of the biggest barriers of their social anxiety in their life was how it impacted their ability to work, because they would have so many difficulties engaging on teams at work, and always kind of feeling defeated, and really like they didn't have a voice. And they said that they would get so anxious that they would call in sick, and they wouldn't go in. And in their first session, later on in the session, they reported that they, after they came into the light and they kind of had that empowerment, at some point they became a dragon. And they were really kind of leaning into this sense of power and kind of mighty force. And they said they were flying around the Baltimore area, and they showed up as part of this dragon. They showed up as part of this flight at their job site. And they kind of burst through the doors, and they said in that moment, they began to burn it down and eat all of the people, all of their coworkers. And what was interesting is that several days after they had gone back to work, we saw them for an integration therapy session, and they came in and said, "Oh my gosh, I went back to work and all I could do was laugh because how can I be afraid of people I can eat?" And it was kind of amazing. Their social anxiety completely went away. And they, like I mentioned, within 4 months, they were being offered, or 6 months, they were being offered kind of full-time employment. They were really kind of expanding their role in that location. And it was just really exciting to see how strong of a relation that experience was to help them. And the last anecdote I'll share for this person was in their second psilocybin session, they had the experience of becoming a fox queen. And they described this experience as showing up on a hilltop in this kind of fox regalia. And in almost no time, there were all of these foxes, these little foxes that were assembling to worship her. And they said that in this experience, one of the things that occurred to them was that she was worthy, that she had everything she needed inside to be worthy of love, to be worthy of adoration, and to really kind of feel and embody that sense of being loved, and to have safety in that sense of being loved and worshipped. And months later, we followed everyone in the study up to 12 months after their sessions. And months later, these were things that they came back to that helped them when inevitably the stresses of life or other challenging experience of life come up. These were some of the experiences that really seemed to kind of help them to continue to connect with that empowerment, to connect with the love and that sense of being kind of embodied in their life. So where does this leave us? Well, this leaves us very grateful for the blessings that I've had in my professional work to be able to connect with that individual and to connect with this topic. From a research perspective, this also leaves us, I think, with a stronger sense, at least a stronger foundation of needing more information about how important it is to have perhaps these transcendent experiences at the same time as you're getting new information or insight, because both seem to be related not only in our survey studies, but also with the people that are having these experiences in the trials. They seem to be really important in producing long-lasting behavior and psychological changes. We also, I think several of my colleagues also agree that these could, continue to point to some of transdiagnostic psychological mechanisms of change. So it could be that regardless of the type of problem that one might be having, whether it's substance use problems, depression, anxiety, or trauma-based concerns, it could be that mystical experiences and insight experiences, when they co-occur, could be helpful in any variety of types of situations. And it's important to also point out that people continue to report, and the people of color in our survey certainly reported this as well, that it's been among the most psychologically insightful and spiritually significant experiences of their entire lives. And that's something that we see not only in our survey studies, but of course in our trials as well. So I'm hopeful that we can use some of this data to justify, at least in part, the importance of focusing some clinical trial work on people of color, to specifically start digging into this in a laboratory setting so that we can hopefully show that this treatment is efficacious in this population and specifically, or in these populations, and specifically with regard to trauma. So obviously there's been a lot of work done with MDMA. However, it's possible, based not only on what they're saying, but on the amount of people who have depression, but where their depression, or let's say their substance use disorder, or any of these problems are trauma-based. And so I think it's also possible that psilocybin and other psychedelics may be helpful for people with trauma, and it's important that we start looking at those in clinical trials as well. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm very interested in extending some of this work into LGBT populations. We already have an ongoing study among native Spanish-speaking individuals that we're working on, and so hopeful to continue this work with those different populations. I did want to just put a quick plug in for Source Research Foundation. As you can see on the screen, we are connecting with a lot of students in psychedelics. We just announced our 2020 grant recipients, or I think we're in the process of announcing that on Facebook. We have so far awarded 18 grants to young people who are studying a lot of different topics in psychedelic science. We have students who are representing history departments. We have students in anthropology, psychology, medicine. We have some in Latinx studies, kind of neuroscience, really all over the place. And unfortunately, we haven't even been able to support all of the applications that we've had come in. And we've had applicants applying from music programs and lots of different places that we're hopeful that as we grow and as we are able to bring in more funding to help support these people, that we can just continue to grow in the breadth of types of disciplines that are represented here. But each of these students, I think, is part of the future of psychedelic science, and we're excited to support them. I did want to mention that in 2021, we are launching a community grants program. And so people in your organization or people you know might be interested in this. We're hopeful to announce the specifics about it in January. But this will be grants that will be set aside for people who are not doing research, but who want to in some way connect research, specifically psychedelic research, to their community. And to be honest with you, I don't even think we know of all the different possible ways that that could happen. So we're going to try to keep the grant program as open as possible in terms of what people might be inspired to do to connect psychedelic science to their communities. But please check us out for that. And also in 2021, as part of our student researcher grant program and as part of our community grant program, we will be specifically recruiting and awarding funds to help support people of color in research as well as in community, bringing this work to their communities. So we're really excited about all of this, and you can find out more on our website, sourceresearchfoundation.org. And with that, I will end, and hopefully there's time for questions if anybody has any.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alan. That was an amazing presentation and such wonderful work that you're doing. I really love that you ended up with the Source Research Foundation, because I think that work is so critical. And I also wanted to mention, I don't know if Amar Gorman is on the call here, but he was emailing me the other day and saying that there's going to be an event through our friends at Fluence coming up, I think on the 13th of November. I'll try and put this in the chat. But they're going to have a fundraiser for their program for training therapists, specifically of color, that Alan and some of the other folks at the Source Research Foundation will be at. So.
Yes, they've been really wonderful in connecting, and we're going to launch a partnership where we'll announce more of the specifics then, but essentially they want to be supportive in helping students, and both organizations want to be helpful to supporting people of color. So we're going to be trying to connect some of our initiatives and really try to bridge some of the work, because we're both both organizations are very passionate about training and supporting trajectories of underrepresented individuals in psychedelics. So we're really excited about that connection.
Wonderful. So we'll move into the Q&A section right now. I think probably the easiest thing is going to be for people to type their questions into the chat. I was having a little bit of trouble with the chat earlier. I don't know if there's a setting on it, Sherry. But if someone wants to type any questions into the chat, and we'll see if we can get that going. We can also potentially have people ask questions in person if they want. If they want to indicate that in the chat, we can call on them and people can ask in person. But we'll ask to keep the questions somewhat short, just out of respect for everyone's time. I'd like to start out. I have too many questions, I think, but I would love to know, just looking at this particular study, and I'm thinking back to in 2016 when I went to Horizons and heard Rick Dolan, bless his heart and soul, and the work that he's done and doing. But I remember sort of cringing when he was saying that they had 0% participation, African American participation, in the phase 2 trial for the MDMA work for PTSD. So I'm curious, one, how did you go about recruiting participants for the study? I know it's completely different than clinical research, but how did you go about recruiting so many participants or respondents of color for this study? And what do you think are the barriers that need to change in terms of allowing or providing access for research studies for participants of color?
Yes, so I'm just writing a little note for myself so I don't forget the second part of the question because it's really important. So regarding the first part of the question, for the survey study, we connected with Qualtrics, which is a company that allows people to do online surveys. And they have what's called a program that curates research panels. And they are essentially, they kind of network with a bunch of organizations to help you recruit people into your studies. And one thing that we did when we reached out to them, we said, we have this very specific project. We were looking for people of color in the US and Canada. And they were able to provide us the ability to recruit from the people of color who had signed up in one of their programs. Excuse me. They had to still go through a screening process to get into the study because we wanted to make sure that they were not just taking the survey to take it or to get the incentive, but because they really were kind of what we would consider like a qualified participant. And it was, we had many, I think, I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head right now, but we had certainly many people kind of attempt to get in the study. We ended up with 517 people through that process. And so we, in terms of the barriers to, that's one barrier is how do you find these people for a survey study, but how do you connect with people to invite them into a trial is a whole different story. And I, as part of my work at Hopkins and also at Ohio State, it is very challenging, I think, to overcome some of the institutional barriers that exist between academic research and communities of color, and especially in a setting like Baltimore, where Johns Hopkins specifically has had a very troubled past in terms of their relationship with communities of color, specifically in academic research. And so I think in part, it's one thing to say that this exists, right? That there is this troubled history and that there is a lot to overcome. But unfortunately, I think what ends up happening is that it has been in the past so difficult to connect with communities that are also not necessarily represented on the team of investigators that is working on this work. And I think that my guess is that until we have a situation really in a variety of academic places, until we have a situation where communities not only feel that they're represented on the teams that want to ask them questions or to provide them an experimental treatment, but also where the types of things that they're interested in and the ways in which they think about the problems that they're having are also included in the aims of the research study. So I think that academic science has a long way to go in not only fulfilling kind of the obligation to have diversity and representation on the teams, but I think by doing that, there will be new questions that will be asked. There will be questions that are asked that will pertain more strongly to, sorry, I'm getting a lot of feedback from someone.
I see feedback from you.
Maybe that's better. In any event, I think it's a multi-layered, challenging systemic process that needs to be corrected at multiple levels. Not only does it need to be corrected on at the team level of who's conducting these studies, but it also can be done by connecting to communities directly in the meantime, so that we can have representation by, for example, community partners, people on community advocacy or advice committees who can work with investigators to better represent the communities that they're interested in studying. So it's not surprising to me that the big clinical trials that have happened so far haven't been able to do this, because they have been underrepresented at the investigator level, and they haven't been reaching out to communities directly to create studies that would be specific to their communities. So I think all at multiple levels this needs to be worked on. Not to plug Source Research Foundation again or Fluence, but that's in part kind of what inspires us about connecting to people who are currently in school, so that they can get into a trajectory where they will be competitive for these investigator positions. And that's really why we find, like, putting the resources and funding and mentorship into the process at that stage hopefully can help to decrease some of the problems going forward.
Excellent. Thank you for that answer. I'm seeing there are a number of questions in the chat here, some of them extensive. Raman wants to know, is there a particular instrument, just sticking with the study, is there a particular instrument that was used to measure race-based trauma, or does such a thing exist?
So Monica Williams has published several studies on this topic and created a trauma symptom scale that is specifically created for race-based trauma symptoms. However, it looks in some ways it looks kind of similar to a PTSD measure or other types of trauma measures, but she developed it specifically for people of color and validated the scale among people of color. So if you look up Monica Williams, it's the Trauma Symptoms Disorders Scale, I believe is the exact name. But also, if people want to reach out to me, I'd be happy to share it with them, and I can email that to whoever would want it. It's freely available to whoever would like to use it.
Excellent, thank you. Ron is wondering, seeing as how in this particular study, the patients, or not the patients, the participants, experienced psychedelics in naturalistic settings. They didn't have the additional benefit of therapy integration work. Do you think that would have changed the outcomes in any direction?
Well, one thing I should mention is that we don't know for sure they didn't have that. I mean, it's possible that some people were in ongoing therapy or working with people for integration. We didn't ask those questions, so we also don't know that's the case. And my best guess is not everybody was, but maybe some people were. Certainly, if we brought this into a clinical trial or even a clinical space where we were able to, adequately prepare everyone as well as work with them therapeutically during and after the experience, it's possible that the results may have been the same or even maybe stronger. We certainly see, from a statistical standpoint, we certainly see stronger outcomes in clinical trials, but part of that is because of all of the things that go into providing this as a therapy. Part of that's also because we exclude a lot of people from those trials, and so you end up with a pretty homogeneous group of people who have kind of very similar types of very specific types of problems. So it's also possible that if we brought, the study for people of color to life, and it might be very different in terms of the effects that we've seen. I mean, until we do a controlled study, we certainly won't know. But I'm optimistic given, the positive results from lots of studies now on MDMA for trauma, as well as psilocybin for depression. And given that the overlap between depression and anxiety and trauma is pretty big, I'm optimistic that we would likely still see some positive effects in a laboratory setting or in a clinical setting specifically.
Thank you for that. I hope I'm going to say this correctly. Zangir is asking, are there specific ways, either with traditional or newer psychedelic therapies, that the therapies are tailored to racial trauma as opposed to other types of trauma?
So that has not been the case yet in the trials that I've worked on, but they haven't been specifically for race-based trauma. I know that Monica has been working on this with MAPS to develop MDMA trials specifically for people of color, and worked on kind of the protocol for that as it would be related specifically to race-based trauma. However, some of that work has been kind of challenging to get up and running, and so she recently switched institutions, I think in part to try to see if she could get the study kind of up and running there. So hopefully there'll be more work done on that, and I think if we were to be able to get the funding for a trial for, let's say, psilocybin for people of color with racial trauma, the intervention for that would undoubtedly need to be tailored specifically for that population. I think we discovered, for example, with our depression study that we recently completed, that the intervention was somewhat similar to other studies for our cancer patients or for even for people who were considered kind of healthy. However, it still took on important nuances. And actually our current trials at Hopkins and the trials coming up going forward here at Ohio State, as well as at Hopkins, and actually several other places, including Yale and NYU and Imperial, are all starting to augment more of the kind of traditional psychedelic therapy approach with evidence-based therapy, looking at acceptance and commitment therapy, motivational interviewing, cognitive behavioral therapy. I think there's some people working with prolonged exposure and augmenting things with MDMA, if I'm not mistaken. So my guess is that similarly, we'll have to look at the best that we know of what can be helpful with racial trauma, and look at including that as alongside or maybe kind of integrated within the standard psychedelic intervention.
Excellent. Mackenzie is asking if participants in this particular study were given the option to report on their settings, and how those settings may differ from clinical approaches.
Yes, and if you give me 1 second, I can actually pull that up and just give you the actual data because I can't remember off the top of my head. Let me see if I can find it very quickly. Here we are. Okay. So the short answer is yes, they were able to report their settings, and it was a variety, but let me tell you what they most often reported. So for this study, almost there, table, data. Aha, here we go. Oh, and of course I didn't put it where I normally do. Anyway, the short answer is I won't give you the exact data, but it was a variety of places. We typically see a mix of people reporting their own home or being at a friend's home or other type of kind of home-like environment, apartment, etc. There also were people who reported festivals or kind of more, I guess, what you would consider like a recreational setting where they perhaps didn't intend to have this maybe psychotherapeutic experience, but that it happened in that kind of setting. And then I believe we also had people reporting some not necessarily clinical in like a clinic setting, but more kind of like they sought out someone who could help them perhaps in an underground setting, but some type of therapeutic helper for that work. So it was a variety, kind of everything from alone and kind of by yourself in your own home to kind of with others in group settings.
Awesome. So Yara Leaks is asking a very important question here, speaking to how, as research institutions, it's going to be possible to reach out to communities of color, specifically when healthcare just across the board, especially mental health care, can be inaccessible of itself, and also potentially stigmatized in those communities. I'm wondering too if you can speak to that, if there's effective ways of reaching it across those divides.
Well, I mean, I certainly don't have all the answers to that question. I mean, I think the way I think about it is there are so many levels of systemic racism and prejudice embedded within all systems in the United States and Canada, more so I think in the United States compared to what I've heard in Canada, although it is still pretty challenging from what I understand from Monica in Canada as well. But in the US, we certainly see this at a variety of institutional levels. And so, yes, I think perhaps one of the first challenges is access. But even if there is access, then you still have a long history of distrust for people in power positions, but especially people who are part of the white culture. And so I think that in part goes to, I think, strengthen the argument for diversifying investigator teams, of having, people involved who not only represent the community, but also can help to, well, I already mentioned this, so I don't want to just repeat it, but essentially to help to tailor the types of studies that we do, that they are appealing and motivating in and of themselves for the communities that might participate. For example, I can come up with 6 different studies that I'd love to do, but I'm coming up with those studies from the vantage point of being a white cisgendered queer man. And so the questions that I'm interested in as an investigator are certainly biased by some of that. And so I think that has an effect on when someone, let's say perhaps a person of color, perhaps a non-binary individual of color who sees an ad to one of my studies, is like, well, that's not quite the vibe that I'm interested in. So why would I screen for that study? Why would I call that number? Even if they're not necessarily having a difficult time with access, it could just be that it's not connecting in the way that it needs to for that person to be internally motivated to go through perhaps some of the challenging emotional and environmental barriers that it would take to actually engage in that type of study. So that's why I think it's really critical that both parts of this process have to be tailored specifically for the topic if I think we're going to have success in bridging some of the divide.
Excellent. Sung is asking, how can researchers become culturally competent as they do psychedelic research? Because clearly this is an issue that, we're not going to diversify every psychedelic research therapy team overnight. So what kinds of motions towards competency can people who are already in the work right now work towards?
I mean, it's a difficult question. I mean, I think that my best suggestion would be that to have cultural competency as part of not just a professional goal, but a personal one. And I think the degree to which you can connect your personal value system to the importance of cultural competency and spending the time and the resources in exploring that in your personal life and helping to find ways to bridge that into your professional life, I think will go a long way to decreasing some of the problems. I don't know for sure. I mean, again, I'm kind of biased from my own vantage point, and I know that, you know, I was fortunate to, for example, be in a clinical psychology program that had a very strong emphasis on diversity education. So I was kind of lucky in that way that I brought that, and I also had this minority perspective of my own identity that helped me, I think, be perhaps more curious in some ways, or at least perhaps more willing to focus on that, and to spend time exploring that, and to be able to get the clinical training needed to hopefully be able to have some sensitive conversations with regarding this topic. I do think it's important that we start asking ourselves, like, how does this work affect not only the work and in whether it's a research setting or a clinical setting, but how does it affect you personally? How does this affect your community and your family and the people that are important to you? And how is perhaps the lack of focusing on it negatively affecting perhaps people that you're connected to, or maybe perhaps people that you're not connected to? So I think that it's a very non-specific answer. I'm kind of unsatisfied with my own answer, and I apologize for that. But I do think I think there's an importance of personal and professional exploration here, and I'll kind of leave that question, I guess, with an anecdote. When I was in clinical training, not with psychedelics yet, but when I was in clinical training in psychology, there was this chaplain, a nun, and she was really great, but I was really struggling at that time to like figure out, like, how do I be a clinical psychologist, and how do I do this thing? And I'm trying to do research, and I'm trying to, you know, learn how to be a clinician, and somehow I got on this topic with her, and she sat and listened to me for a really long time, as chaplains tend to do, and she just quiet nodded and kind of spent that time with me. And at the very end, I'm thinking, okay, here it comes. She's going to give me like the breakthrough advice of my life. And it was not what I anticipated, but it ended up being pretty breakthrough, because she said, I think you've forgotten that you're a human being and not a human doing. And I was just like it blew me out of the water. And I think what that meant to me was I need to learn how to connect to who I am, and explore that in order to better connect with others and explore the outside relationships. And the degree to which I can focus on this and bridge these things together. I'm not a researcher. I'm a human who happens to be, you know, doing this thing from time to time that I have a passion about. And I think that if we can connect to these passions and connect to who we are and explore the bridging these different facets of ourselves, that we're likely to get, I guess, maybe somewhere closer to the answer to that question.
Excellent. I'm actually going to turn it over to Nick, who had introduced the group earlier. Him and I had come up with a few questions. I know he might have a couple of questions that he wants to ask too. There are some other questions here, but they are from folks who have already answered or asked questions. So if other people have questions, please feel free to continue to write them in the chat, and we'll try to address those first, just out of the interest of giving everybody a chance to speak.
So yeah, I appreciate that, Benoit. One of the things before I ask a question that I was wondering if we could do, now that it seems like the questions are a little more under control, is actually hearing voices of the people that have asked. So I know, Yarlix, you were next in the question. I'm wondering if you feel comfortable asking Alan the question you wrote yourself.
Yeah, sure. So hi everyone, my name is Yarlix. I'm a director of the New York City Psychedelic Society and co-founder of the Baltimore Psychedelic Society when I was out there. And I'm worried about like issues around access, and also just tying back to how, like in my earlier question, like a lot of people of color like barely have mental health care at all. Like I'm, from my family and friends, I'm the only person that has a therapist, and we're like relatively okay compared to some other immigrants that might be more low income and things like that. And so, Alan, I appreciated your answer about diversifying research teams, but like I was in academia for a while. I'm currently in research. I work for the government. And once someone is in a position of power, they're never going to leave. Like they're just like, this is my position and this is my title and I'm not giving it up. And so like, you know, that's part of this like system of white supremacy, where a lot of white people that are at the top tend to like stay there because they like the power and the money. And so it's like changes because of people getting out or because people are getting pushed out. I find it kind of difficult to envision a way in which we equitably bring in people of color, given how difficult it is for us to get education in the first place, you know, because like to get a master's or to get a PhD is way more difficult for a low-income person of color than maybe like a white middle-class person. So I'm just wondering, like, how do we address these issues of power hoarding that exist within the psychedelic space so that you know, we can actually have a conversation about potentially diversifying diversifying the psychedelic space so that people of color could be part of these research teams?
Mm-hmm. Well, I really appreciate the question. And I think as the challenge with anything in this area is there's so many different levels to think about it, you know. So I know that, you know, when I think about this question, the first thing I think about is, well, how is for example, let's use an example, when money comes into a research team, right? And you mentioned kind of the hoarding of resources. When large amounts of money come into a team, and if anything, we're saying that that's probably just going to continue. There's a lot of money coming into psychedelic research right now. It's likely to only increase over the next couple of years. And when that happens, how is that money spent? How is the money going to be spent looking at just reinforcing the current structure? Can money and can funders who are interested in funding sites bring into the conversation the topic of diversification on the teams and diversification in the types of participants that are going to be coming into the studies, diversification in terms of the students who will get opportunities to intern or to get trained in these settings. And I think there's a lot of different ways that funders who frankly have in this regard even more power than the investigators do, because without the funding, the team can't persist. So I do think that those conversations should be a part of funding that comes into these places. Is not only kind of, you know, we want to fund you and support the work that's going on, but how are we going to expand? How are we going to grow? How are we going to work on this systemic issue? So I think that part of it needs to be that when large sums of money do come into an institution. However, one of the challenges that I have seen since coming to Ohio State, where there has been really no psychedelic research going on and really trying to kind of build a new team here, is that when I look externally to where kind of up to the current time point where money has been kind of invested, money seems to attract money, right? So if there is, you know, a center of psychedelic research at Hopkins or at NYU or Imperial or wherever it is, that kind of name kind of brings and confers privilege and power to attract other donors. And so I think that if we're going to get in a space where we can actually disperse some of this power and resource to different disciplines, different studies, different types of teams and settings, then in part, I think the onus is on the people who are in those places to recognize, you know, how much do you actually need to do the things that you're doing, and how much can be then diverted to other topics, other centers. How can we actually even maybe think of a situation where it's not just a psychedelic center, but it is a conglomerate of a variety of psychedelic centers that are sharing resources and opportunities. You know, and there's precedent for that. I mean, there's precedent for conducting multi-site studies where, you know, there's a centralized system of data collection where you can be partnering and collaborating with investigators all around the world on a specific topic. In part, there is, I believe, a student organization out of Pennsylvania who is working on kind of a situation like that for students, where they're trying to connect students to different teams and different investigators. So I think we need to start thinking more about connection as opposed to isolation in work. The challenge with that is that I would say, certainly in the United States at least, everything up until this point, psychedelic or not related, in academia is all about siloing, institutionalization of a team and a process and kind of carrying on the banner of that institution, as opposed to this model of what things may look like if you start actually diversifying not only teams, but diversifying resources across different teams and connecting in the process, which, you know, the irony is not lost, at least on me, that frequently we hear people report the importance of connection and how that comes up in their psychedelic experiences, and the lack of it that we see in professional spaces right now. So I don't know, again, I feel like this is an inadequate answer to your question, but those are some of the first thoughts that come to my mind of things that we can do. And I do think it's important, you know, as a funder, because of my work with Source Research Foundation, I know that we have a lot of power in our nonprofit to work on this issue, to try to get funds into the hands of people who can be supported in a trajectory. But it also goes beyond that, because we also have power and privilege in terms of our skills and our resources, and finding ways to not only just support financially, but, you know, it might be the case that I'm going to kind of switch gears again. It might be the case that there's a new center or a new group of investigators who don't know how to diversify their team. And so if a funder came in and said, look, I'm willing to invest this money in you, and I also have experience and expertise in this topic of helping this diversification process, or I can help connect you to people who might, you know, there could potentially be more interest in it. I don't think that really gets to your point about like what happens when people who get power just hold on to their power and they don't want to let it go. Like, that obviously is a problem. I think that as people, I'm very hopeful with what I'm seeing with students right now, at least from my little neck of the woods. I'm very hopeful that the students that I'm seeing who are very interested and passionate about social justice and who want to see change occur, that if they can get the support they need, that these will be the future leaders of this space, in academic spaces and in other spaces. And so I think if we can do what we can to support them, at least in my mind, that's got to be a good start.
That's great, Alan, and thanks, Yarlix, for such an important question to consider and to keep thinking about. Along with that, Alan, one of the things that Benoit and I had talked about is like collective blind spots within the psychedelic community. And definitely, I think you were speaking a little bit to it, but being, you know, a cisgender white male that has access to this power, what is the role? I guess this is a two-part question. The first one is a collective blind spots, and the second is, what is the role of somebody that does have access to that power of using it responsibly and focusing more into the representative communities that we want to help?
Well, I can tell you from my own experience, I mean, this was in part, I would say, at least half, if not more, of the inspiration to start a nonprofit and to work on this issue. You know, the time that I started SRF was the same time that I was offered a position at Hopkins. And personally, as someone who straddles this power and privilege line, I did not feel comfortable accessing more power and privilege in my role without having a responsibility to share some of that power in the way that I could, and to find ways to channel some of that power in different ways. And so that's what led to starting Source Research Foundation. And I think that, again, I know that I benefited from power and privilege just to be able to be in a position where I could start a nonprofit on the side. Like, I get that there's, that in part was because I had that power and privilege. However, I do think that it was a part of the responsibility that I had going into places of power and privilege in order to change it in ways that I could, and to bring the topic up when I could, to have a conversation, especially with things like employment. So for example, you know, hiring teams, you know, or hiring students to come into a graduate program, or screening participants. I mean, this happens at so many different levels where the people who are running projects, and it's not just one team. I mean, I've seen this at well, 4 universities now that I've been at and involved in research. Like the people who are involved on the day-to-day basis of running studies, I don't think any of them are bad people. I just think that the people that are there, the 3 people in the room deciding whether this person should have a job, are operating a course from all of the bias and the background that they're bringing in that moment. So I do what I can when I can to advocate for people and to advocate for diversity and social justice, and to advocate for and to, when I can, if I have the power to spend money the way I want to, or to hire the type of individual that I want to, then finding ways to connect not only for the people that happen to apply, but also seeing, can we get the notice out there to people who might not come across it in the traditional way. So I'm happy that for me, at least, I've been able to find a path where I can be an advocate where I can. And I do think it is my responsibility, because I have power and privilege as a white cisgendered male, to do so when I have the ability to do that. And I think investigators need to lean into understanding more about what that responsibility is and acting on it, and standing up against, the large forces that are kind of acting in perhaps the opposite, or at least not in a congruent fashion.
Thanks, Alan. Mackenzie, you had a question in the chat. Did you want to share that one?
Yeah, sure. Hey, it's great to be here with everybody today. And thank you, Nick and Benoit, for making sure that this got facilitated so beautifully. So my question is around reparations. And when we start talking about racial trauma, we must also come to understand like the history of racial trauma, right? In this country and in the context in which it happens. And it just so happens when we talk about the funding sources, Alan, that these are all private. And the expectation for private source clinical trials is completely different than the 1993 Revitalization Act that's trying to increase minorities and women participation in clinical trials. So what we've done, and I understand that we had to do the private sourcing and all of that to get these medicines to where they are today, so we could even have this conversation. But moving forward, I would like to hear what you have to say about a reparations movement for if these medicines can really help heal people from racial trauma. As these things become decriminalized and the government might be putting in federal funding into things, how can we move towards that, towards making those priority metrics into policy, into real, actual things with teeth, not just necessarily, the way our team looks. I'm talking about actual, like things, like the actual policies in place that enforce something.
Yeah. Well, it's a great point. I mean, part of what I was getting at with the importance of funding and who is making the determination of funding is because when you look at the NIH, for example, as you just mentioned, there are specific requirements for people who are going to get funds from the NIH to address specific things related to gender inequity and race and ethnicity inequity in academic science. And that's something, I'm not saying they do it perfectly, and I'm not saying that there isn't more that could be done there either, because certainly there could, but it's at least something that, because they have the power to have that written into their policy of funding, they then can require among the applicants who seek funds from them. And so that's at least a piece of that puzzle. And I think because you're absolutely right, because of the nature of the type of funding that has really kind of really gotten us to where we are right now with even being able to have these conversations in psychedelic science, they don't have the same type of institutional legacy and or understanding of the nuances. A lot of the funders, they're funding this because they're passionate about the topic, and some are certainly funding it for a variety of other, perhaps, other reasons, depending on what they're funding. But they don't have the same level of knowledge about some of these issues that one would hope. With NIH, they at least had, as part of their last 30 years history of this topic, they at least recognized that it was important to put those policies in place. But individual donors and nonprofit foundations don't necessarily have to do that, or are not even necessarily aware of it. So in part, more could be done to educate funders, and it's possible. I mean, one of the things that So I'm now primarily in a college of social work. And what's interesting is in social work, as this related to this topic, there's much more of an emphasis on social justice. And I've noticed that the types of funders that fund that kind of work so far have not necessarily been the same type of funders that have funded psychedelics. And if you look at kind of like even kind of governmental funded research, you know, it all kind of looks a little bit different, I think, in terms of who's interested, who has the passion, who wants to do it. But I don't know, perhaps there's a way to work unilaterally across institutions with creating policy around any type of funding that comes into the university. I mean, so far, to my knowledge, most of the effort has had to do with the specific funder recognizing they want those policies. Perhaps if there was kind of a cross-institutional policy that said, regardless of the funding source, these things have to be addressed in a grant application or in a study that's going to be funded externally in order for those funds to be accepted by the university. I mean, I think the university certainly should have power enough power in that place to at least put institutional policies. But if there was some way to do it across the board, where there was some type of similar policy to like government funded grants where those things had to be included, perhaps that would be a possibility. I don't know, I feel like I'm kind of going off the rails with my answer at this point. Did I answer completely, or was there a piece that I missed?
I think you've hit it. It's, you know, it's just it's got to be when we talk about these things, it has to be a system-wide change. It can't be just one research team doing something.
Absolutely. Yeah, because it's a systemic problem, right?
Right, that's exactly right.
Yeah, it has to be more than just one space and one setting and one team. Yeah.
Thank you.
I want to jump in for 1 second, Nick, and this is the last part of that answer was sort of piggybacking off a question that someone had fielded me almost rhetorically, just in view of all the money that is coming into some of these research centers as they're popping up, and a lot of that money being going towards sort of creating the image of credibility around psychedelics in society, and just maybe thinking about if there's a mechanism that we can put in place that says, for X amount of dollars that you're putting in to forward this research in these medicines, like there are stipulations that we also have to address these other factors that are clearly at play within the research in terms of the need for more diverse access and representation. So maybe there's some kind of way that we can think about pushing research institutions, exactly like you said, to develop these more intentional guidelines or structures for receiving money that can, like you said, distribute it in a way that that does sort of ensure some of this equitable work gets funded. And then I also I noticed that Dwayne had I think maybe he had messaged you, Nick, too, but he was saying that he had a question to ask. So Dwayne, if you would like to unmute yourself and ask, please ask away.
Hi, Alan. Thanks so much for the presentation. And again, thanks for all the participants and their questions as well. Certainly adds to it. And just a little caveat, I think I met you briefly at last year's Horizon, I think after your discussion, your presentation. So glad to hear a follow-up on your work. A little bit of background, just context for where this question is coming from. I used to work, I did 3 years in direct psychiatric care, and I also had previous work in mental health from the community level through NAMI. One of the things that I've seen and was kind of in talking with other community members in the psychedelic scenes, as well as my own, research in mental health, that's concerning about the current model of the psychedelic therapy assisted work is for trauma is on the individual level. what resources, there seems to be a lack of resources for the individual in terms of reintegrating into his or her community, especially if that community has had stigma around drug use, the rate, drug, the drug war, the level of crime, hardships, all those other things. How does one reintegrate into that? Seems like the psychedelic research as well as the psychedelic communities as a whole don't seem to be addressing that, or at least in large from what I've observed and just in talking to other people. And then the other criticism that I've heard is the lack of resources from a systemic level of, well, okay, we give these folks, these lucky few, this great chance to have these mystical, life-changing, life-altering experiences. And then we follow up with some questionnaires, weeks, months, maybe a year or two afterwards. But what are we doing in terms of addressing those factors that created the trauma on an environmental and a systemic level and a community level as whole? What are we doing to address the economic hardships or the lack of resources, food insecurities, lack of funding going into these communities, when you have so many people crammed into one space that are competing like rats in a barrel, what are we doing to address those systemic levels? Because it's one thing to give these folks a great experience and then just thrust them back out there. And I've seen that similar kind of pattern in psychiatric care, where it's like a person who comes in for acute experience and let's stabilize them. So we just, dose them with known drugs. And then after they're quote unquote stabilized a week later, based on whatever evaluation criteria for meeting a person between 10 to 15 minutes, let's just thrust them back out there into the cold, leaving them, on the steps back to square one where they have little to no resources. That, is like, well, what are we exactly doing? We just seem to be kicking the can down the street and not really addressing those issues. So I don't know if you've had those conversations or if you've heard those types of criticisms, but what are your thoughts and perspectives on that?
Well, thank you, Dwayne. That's another complex question, which I know is it's great because we are in a place in psychedelic science and clinical and research work where these types of questions are really important to start asking now. And you're absolutely right. I think in my experience prior to coming to psychedelic research and clinical work, I certainly saw the disparities in mental health care and psychiatry and the way in which we kind of worked with patients already, which in a lot of spaces was similar to what you just described. And of course, in a research setting, it is almost always the case where you have a time limited, specific point in time where, you're doing something with someone and then they're done. And to be completely free of confounding factors, you're supposed to limit your contact with people. And luckily, I was fortunate enough to have most of my clinical psychedelic training done with Mary Casamano, and she certainly has a different perspective on this, which I was really fortunate to learn from. And it was very different for me coming from a place where I had been trained in all of those prior settings of, the professionals, have a distance, and there's always a kind of a boundary, and you're not supposed to get too close to people, and not supposed to help them, more than they're willing to help themselves, and that kind of rhetoric. And then to witness someone like Mary, who, really is in it for the connection and the long haul, and to see how she cultivates relationships. Our volunteers, at least at Hopkins, are volunteers that I've worked with and the ones that I've been around while other people were working with them. We certainly don't just kind of put them out there. And I think, of course, there is an end to the official study. However, we've been fortunate enough to be able to follow and connect with people, many months and even years after their experience, and welcome that type of connection, because we do know that, there, especially with psychedelics, I think, and I would say this is probably true more broadly to mental health care, but I think especially with something like psychedelics, where there is such a close and intimate relationship that's created in that type of work, that it would be unethical in that situation to kind of cast people off and to discontinue contact. And so it has taken a little bit, I think, of me being more open and kind of opening up to the idea of what does it look like to have an ongoing connection perhaps with someone, and why is that important specifically in this work. And I think, you know, we could do a whole presentation on the ins and outs of like the relationship that's created as part of this work in a therapeutic context. But I certainly think that a guide or a therapist or a provider needs to be open to ongoing work and connection with someone who comes in to have this type of experience, perhaps especially people who are most vulnerable to things like disconnection, isolation, and kind of being discarded by society. And so when you start getting into these types of vulnerable populations, I think it's even more imperative that we think about the paradigms that we're creating and how the ongoing support and relationship is really critical to their capacity to not only benefit initially from this type of experience, but to maintain and experience a persisting benefit from the experience. I also don't necessarily think that just because we're looking at it one specific way in a research setting, meaning they come in, they have therapy, they have a session or two of psilocybin or some other psychedelic, and then they have some follow-up therapy and they're kind of officially done with the study. I doubt very much that that will be what it looks like when and if FDA approves this. I mean, I think initially those models might be what is recreated in clinical settings, but almost certainly there would be much more latitude for providers to have a more thoughtful treatment plan with people. And hopefully they will take into consideration this issue of needing to really connect with people. You know, we haven't, I know you touched on this, so I want to at least mention it, that it's in part because of this that we're starting our community grants program at SRF. So we feel very strongly that, and I feel very strongly that psychedelic research is only one piece of this puzzle. We also have to transform communities, and we have to transform language and vocabulary. We have to transform relationships. And the only way that the psychedelic therapy has any chance of working is if people can eventually go back into a community who not only has a vocabulary and a language about these experiences and can understand them and support them, but where they can have an actual reintegration into something that is healthy and functional and can support the ongoing work that this really takes to be successful. And we're hoping, I think, in part that those community grants can be done to start helping to address some of that at the same time as we're putting more money into the research studies on the intervention itself.
Thank you so much for that answer, Alan. That really was touching on all kinds of things that I think about a lot. Especially for me, I see exactly what you're talking about with that sort of thinking about long-term relational setting as being one of the key factors in my mind that distinguishes the traditional use of psychedelics, which maybe happen in a more tribal context or in a more familiar context where people literally live with the people that they're having these experiences with every day. And so there is sort of this, this ongoing level of integration that comes from naturally being a part of the community, and sort of this other clinical treatment model that we're creating here. And just, I think the necessity of really looking at some of those other more traditional relationships of psychedelic use and how we can better be inspired by them is an important venture. I know that we have just reached 5 o'clock, so unfortunately we're going to have to wrap this up for everyone. There is an option for anyone that wants to return to our original breakout groups if people still wanted to connect there. I guess if anyone wants to do that, put some messages in the chat and maybe we can do that. For everyone else, thank you for joining us for this conversation. I think it was really wonderful and rich, and thank you, Alan, for so much of your work and the perspectives that you're bringing to this. It's incredibly refreshing to see.
Thank you. And I just wanted to say, I put a link in the chat for a free webinar this Friday that I'm hosting for another topic on our outcomes from our depression trial for using psilocybin. So if anyone wants to come and join, it's free to the public and it's this Friday at 7 p.m.
Awesome. I'm not seeing any requests.
Thank you. Thank
so-
you so much for having this webinar. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you, Alan, so much for doing this.
Oh, thank you so much. It's lovely to connect with everyone.
Awesome. I guess we'll be ending the meeting then. So thank you, everybody. And we look forward to tuning in to our next DOI produced event with Jay Sebelius in December, and the next event with Dr. Bossis for the BPRG in a little while as well. So thank you, everyone, and we'll hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Hey, thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.